You know, I think most people have heard of the Kurds, right? But few really grasp the sheer scale and complexity of their story, their resilience. We're
Exactly.
talking, what, 50 to 60 million people globally? That makes them one of the largest stateless nations anywhere. It's quite astonishing.
It really is.
So today we're doing a deep dive into that, how Kurdish culture, their identity, has shown this remarkable continuity while facing just immense pressure for recognition. Our mission really is to dig into the sources and pull out the key insights so you can understand this incredibly resilient, multifaceted story.
Absolutely. And we'll definitely go beyond the sort of surface level headlines. This dive will get into the nuances, the challenges, the surprising developments, too, that shape what it means to be Kurdish today.
Okay, let's get into it then. The sources make it clear this isn't some, recent identity, it's deeply rooted. So what are some of those historical foundations we should know about?
Well, what's really striking is how far back it goes and how much it's tied to their geography. These mountainous regions, the tribal structures that evolved there, and their position, often on the periphery of big empires or central states.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, as one leading scholar, Martin van Brunissen, pointed out, these weren't just background details. They fundamentally shaped Kurdish society for centuries.
That makes sense. So how did those deep roots, that geography, then collide with the forces that started dividing them up?
Right. Well, this is where the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne comes in. It's just such a critical and, frankly, devastating turning point. This treaty didn't just redraw borders and scatter Kurdish lands across Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria. It effectively erased them from the map, politically speaking, from formal international recognition anyway.
Wow, erased them.
Yeah. Imagine 50 million people just rendered sort of invisible on the official world stage. It really laid the groundwork for, well, a century of cultural and political marginalization.
But they weren't actually erased, culturally speaking.
Not at all. And that's the key. Despite that political fragmentation, their culture became this incredibly powerful binding force. The Kurdish language itself, which isn't just one thing, it's a family of dialects like Kurmanji, Sorani, Zazaki, Korani.
Right.
Along with their music, their distinct clothing, their literature, these remained vital markers. Things like the epic Memu Zin by Emid Egzani, written back in the 17th century, weren't just stories. They were and are cultural touchstones, binding Kurds across these imposed borders.
That's fascinating. And I remember the sources mentioning origin myths, too. How did those fit in, even if they're maybe not strict history?
Yeah, exactly. While some accounts, might be historically debatable, like tracing lineage to figures like Zahak or King Solomon's servants or even Prophet Abraham's wife Sarah, these myths were incredibly important early on.
Awesome.
They provided a sense of shared, almost mystical origin, a common identity that went beyond just immediate circumstances. And then there's the claim, controversial but potent, linking them to the ancient Medes, who had this big empire way back. It grounds their identity in this very deep historical narrative.
So the land fragmentation wasn't just Lausanne in 1923.
No, that was the second, arguably more impactful one. The first major political division actually happened way earlier, back in 1639, between the Ottoman and Safavid empires. Okay, you got the post-World War I division, sealed by Lausanne, splitting them mainly between Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, plus some in the Soviet Union. That's the one that really defined the modern struggle. It highlights this recurring theme you see, external powers constantly redrawing their map, shaping their destiny.
Right. And here's where it gets, I think, really compelling. Despite all that, the division, the suppression, the culture, and language just show incredible resilience. How did language specifically become such a powerful act of resistance?
That's really the heart of it, isn't it? I mean, take Turkey, where the Kurdish language was banned in public life for decades in the 20th century. Did it disappear? No. Instead, it kind of went underground, and then you see this amazing resurgence, especially in informal settings, homes, communities, but crucially now, through digital media too. Language became more than just communication. It was a symbol of identity, a direct challenge.
Can you give some examples of how that resurgence looks today?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You see it with Kurdish satellite TV channels like Sturk TV or Medya Haber, broadcasting across borders, online platforms like the Kermansi Institute, preserving and teaching the language. And then you have Rojava in northern Syria, where despite the conflict, they've actually institutionalized Kurdish language education, That's a huge, huge step. First time in modern Syrian history.
That's incredible. And it sounds like the diaspora, the Kurds living outside Kurdistan, have been crucial too.
Oh, massively important. The Kurdish diaspora, especially big communities in Germany, Sweden, the UK, they've become these vital hubs for publishing, for music, for filmmaking.
Right.
You have artists, people like Kai Bahar, Shivan Perwer, Jiwan Hako, whose work really contributes to this sense of transnational Kurdish identity. Their creativity thrives in exile, connecting people back to the homeland.
So these communities are like cultural engines.
Exactly. Think about the big Kurdish cultural festivals in places like Berlin, Stockholm, London. They're not just parties, they're political statements, artistic gatherings keeping solidarity alive. Sweden, in particular, became known as a kind of safe haven for writers and artists in exile. They even got some government support there for Kurdish language and literature. It shows how exile, paradoxically, can sometimes strengthen these cultural bonds. And it started early. The very first Kurdish periodical, Kurdistan, was actually published in Cairo back in 1898, but quickly moved to Europe. The first satellite TV, MED TV in the 90s, that started in Europe too.
Okay, so there's the external pressure, the resilience, the diaspora engine. But it's not all external, right?
No.
The sources point to internal challenges complicating things too.
Yeah, that's a critical point to understand. While culture often binds Kurds together, politics frequently divides them. I mean, look at the KDP, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, and the PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, in Iraqi Kurdistan.
Right, in Bashan.
Exactly. Their rivalry, it wasn't just political disagreement. It blew up into a full-blown civil war in the 1990s. That obviously weakened the broader cause. And you see similar divisions, maybe based on region or ideology, between Kurdish groups in Syria, Turkey, and Iran too.
So definitely not a monolithic bloc. What about other pressures, like assimilation, especially for younger Kurds in big cities?
That's another huge factor. Beyond the political splits, you have the pull of assimilation and globalization. Younger generations, especially in cities like Istanbul or Tehran or even Berlin, they're often caught in this difficult balancing act, trying to integrate into the wider society, get jobs, education, while also holding on to their cultural memory. One sociologist, Nicole Watts, observed how these urban Kurdish youth are juggling multiple identities: Kurdish, Turkish, or Iranian, or German, maybe cosmopolitan, often without much institutional support for their Kurdish side. And digital culture, it's a double-edged sword here. It helps preserve things, connects people, sure, but it also risks kind of flattening identity into just symbols, flags, music clips, without the deeper knowledge or the lived experience sometimes.
You mentioned earlier the language isn't monolithic either. How does that linguistic diversity or fragmentation play into this?
It's a really significant challenge, actually. We talked about the main groups: Kurmanji, Sorani, Zalzakadimli, Aramagorani. Generally speaking, they aren't mutually intelligible.
Really? That different?
Yes, some linguists compare the difference between Kurmanji and Sorani to, say, English and German. It's substantial. And then to make it even trickier, they use different writing systems.
Oh, right.
You've got a modified Arabic script, mainly for Sorani, a Roman script based on the Turkish alphabet, mostly for Kurmanji, and even Cyrillic was used in the past in the Soviet Union. This makes Pan-Kurdish communication, especially written communication, inherently difficult.
Wow. Okay. And we touched on state repression, but maybe we can look closer at how that specifically targeted language.
Sure. State repression has been, pervasive, and language has often been a primary target. In Turkey, for instance, there was that official ban on using Kurdish in public domains from 1938. It was legalized in 1991, but major obstacles remain. Still no Kurdish medium schools, for example, and Kurdish cultural activities can still get labeled as terrorist activities.
And Iran, Syria.
In Iran, Persian is the only official language.
Right.
Use of Kurdish in media is very limited, state-controlled, heavily censored, no official status in schools. In Syria, similarly, no official recognition. For decades, teaching any language other than Arabic in schools was banned, as some call it linguicide.
So pretty bleak picture in those three.
Mostly, yes. But Iraq is the interesting contrast. Under the British mandate, Kurdish, specifically the Sorani dialect, got recognized as a local language. Later, it became a second official language in Iraq. And since 2005, in the autonomous Kurdistan region of Iraq, Kurdish is the language of government, education, everything. Though interestingly, even within the KRG, there's debate between Sorani and Kurmanji speakers about official status.
That shows the complexity even where there is autonomy. Okay, let's dig a bit deeper into that political fragmentation you mentioned earlier. How has this historical disunity really impacted their bigger goals?
Yeah, this disunity isn't new. You have figures like the poet Ahmad Khani back in the 17th century, lamenting the lack of Kurdish unity. And it stretches right up to modern conflicts, like between different Kurdish groups in Iran or that KDP-PUK civil war in Iraq. There's a sort of sobering observation, I think it was Michael Ignatieff who noted it, that historically Kurds have often fought each other as much, or even more than, they've fought side by side against external oppressors.
That's a tough reality.
It is. And many argue this lack of a strong pan-Kurdish sentiment, historically at least, has been a major roadblock. It meant regional movements often ended up being used as pawns by the very states they were resisting.
Right.
So, this leads to the ongoing debate. Should the focus be on secessionism, trying to carve out an independent Greater Kurdistan? Or is autonomism, seeking meaningful self-rule within existing states, the more pragmatic path? Most see Greater Kurdistan as, well, a dream, given the regional and international opposition.
This whole picture is just so much more complicated than a simple oppressor-oppressed narrative, isn't it? The sources really push back against easy answers about nationalism here.
They really do. And if you look at, say, the interaction between the Turkish state and Kurdish nationalism, a lot of analysis simplifies it. Frames it as just ethnic Kurdish nationalism versus civic Turkish nationalism, or state versus society.
But it's messier than that.
Much messier. Our sources argue those simple frames miss the ambiguity, the back and forth. For example, the idea that Turkish state repression alone is what caused radical Kurdish nationalism. That's challenged. You even had one Turkish scholar, Metin Hepper, controversially claimed Turkish policies weren't really assimilationist. But then you look at his own documented examples, renaming villages, banning Kurdish names, and, well, it's hard to see that as anything but forced assimilation.
Right. So if those simple dichotomies don't work, how can we understand this dynamic?
A more useful approach, drawing on scholars like Frederick Barth and Andreas Wimmer, is thinking about ethnic boundary making.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means seeing ethnicity not as some fixed essential thing people have, but as an active process. It's about how groups constantly define themselves by drawing boundaries, deciding who's in and who's out, and what those boundaries mean. It's dynamic.
Okay, so how did Turkish nationalism draw its boundaries?
Often through a strategy you could call incorporation. High-level figures, like a former chief of general staff or a major party leader, would emphasize Turkishness as his broad, overarching national identity. The idea was, okay, you can be ethnically Kurdish privately, but that identity shouldn't be recognized politically in the public sphere because that could lead to polarization. President Erdogan, more recently, has used a slightly different tack. He acknowledges Kurds historically, but frames unity through shared values, particularly Islam, trying to undercut purely ethnic nationalism by appealing to a different shared identity.
Okay, and how did Kurdish nationalist strategies play this boundary game?
In a couple of ways. One strategy is contraction. You saw this with a former co-chair of the DTP party, Emine Ayna. She seemed to define Kurdishness very narrowly, based on specific political actions, like who you vote for.
Right.
But ironically, that can actually limit the appeal of Kurdish nationalism. And interestingly, she herself wasn't fluent in Kurdish, which adds another layer. Then there's transvaluation. This was used effectively by another DTP co-chair, Ahmet Turk. He directly challenged the hierarchy implied by Turkish nationalism. He demanded equal status, reinterpreted historical events like the Sheikh Zayed and Dersim revolts not as simple uprisings, but as moments of resistance, and even framed the PKK's armed struggle as restoring dignity. He'd make a point of speaking Kurdish in parliament sometimes.
That's fascinating at the elite level. But what about everyday people? How does this play out on the ground? Is identity that fixed?
That's the crucial point, as often not. At the popular level, you see a lot more fluidity, even ambivalence. Many people who speak Kurdish don't necessarily frame their identity in the strict ethnic terms that nationalist movements might demand.
Any examples?
Sure. You have groups like the Zaza speakers, some of whom resist being simply labeled as Kurds and have even participated in anti-PKK protests. You have individuals who prioritize, education, getting a good job, over active political struggle, and people make what are called positional moves. They might downplay their Kurdishness in certain situations because of social stigma or potential trouble, like the engineer mentioned in one source, who only felt comfortable speaking Kurdish on his phone when he stepped out onto his balcony.
Wow.
Or the shop owner, who deliberately sold fewer Kurdish music albums to avoid unwanted attention. There was also that Kurdish businessman who chose to speak Turkish with his own children, saying quite plainly, Their future is in Turkey.
That really highlights the pressures.
It does. And then you have the barber from Diyarbakir feeling like a second-class citizen even though his great-grandfather fought for the Turkish Republic. It shows this deep sense of injustice can coexist with other complex feelings. So Turkish and Kurdish nationalisms, they aren't static blocks. They constantly shape and reshape each other. This leads to concessions sometimes, like Turkey eventually allowing state TV broadcasts in Kurdish or university departments for Kurdish studies. It's a continuous push and pull dynamic.
Okay, so despite all these complexities, the internal divisions, the external pressures, the sources also talk about promising developments, even a strengthening sense of a wider pan-Kurdish identity. What's driving that?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? It seems that modern technology, ironically combined with the shared experience of ongoing pressure, has really started to shift things. There's this sense of a quickening national identity, as one source puts it, that could genuinely lead towards more unity, pan-Kurdish unification even.
What are the main drivers then?
Well, the sources point to three main things. First, political developments, often arising from conflict. Think about the Iraq-Iran War, Turkey's long conflict with the PKK. These forced huge numbers of Kurds to move, to become refugees, creating shared experiences of struggle of homelessness across traditional regional lines. And specifically, the de facto autonomy Kurds achieved in Iraq after 1992 became a real source of hope, a kind of quasi-independent Kurdish state that attracted Kurds from other countries too. In Turkey, despite the ongoing conflict, there has been some increased flexibility since the 90s, allowing the word Kurd, some private teaching, Kurdish publications like Azadiya Welat. In Iran, there was a brief cultural revival during Khatami's presidency, though it didn't last. And even in Syria, despite the harsh repression overall, there's been a little more space for publishing recently, largely thanks to diaspora connections and new media.
Which brings us to the second driver, the diaspora.
Exactly, Kurdish diasporas. We talked about them being cultural engines. They've also become these crucial pan-Kurdish communicative spaces. Even early on, associations formed in exile, in Istanbul or Europe, helped Kurds from different regions start imagining a common homeland. Then the big waves of immigration, especially after the 1980 coup in Turkey, physically brought diverse groups of Kurds together, often for the first time. And now you see huge gatherings for cultural events like Nowruz, the Kurdish New Year on March 21st, tens of thousands celebrating together in European cities. That's a powerful expression of collective identity.
And the third driver, technology.
Yes, absolutely. The third and maybe the most revolutionary new media technologies. Satellite TV and the internet have just fundamentally changed the game for Kurdish communication.
How so?
There's that great quote from Christian Bird. The Kurds may not have their own physical nation, but they do have an international cyberspace state. That really captures it. The launch of MED-TV, the first Kurdish satellite channel, back in 1995. Some Kurds considered that seminal event more important than all Kurdish armed revolutions combined. Think about that.
Wow.
Because these technologies create trans-state networks. They help make the different language varieties a bit more mutually intelligible as people get exposed to them. And crucially, they allow for instant cross-border reactions. When Öcalan was captured in 1999, or when Barzani was inaugurated in Iraqi Kurdistan in 2005, you saw coordinated protests or celebrations erupt simultaneously across Turkey, Iran, Syria, Europe. Technology knitted them together in real time.
So, wrapping this all up, what does it all mean? We've gone from ancient myths and scattered homelands to, digital activism and complex internal debates. It's clear Kurdish identity isn't static at all.
Not in the slightest. If you connect all these threads, Kurdish identity today is incredibly dynamic. It's a plural. There isn't just one way to be Kurdish. And it's often paradoxical, isn't it? Shaped by ancient traditions, but also by TikTok videos, by old tribal codes, but also by modern urban activism, by mother tongues that were suppressed for generations now being revitalized through digital apps. It's this amazing fusion.
Yeah. So we've seen this incredible resilience despite fragmentation, this really complex dance between Turkish and Kurdish nationalisms, the diversity within Kurdishness itself, and then this powerful role of the diaspora and new media pushing towards a broader pan-Kurdish feeling. It's a story of survival, constant adaptation, and this enduring dream.
And perhaps that ability to adapt, without completely losing its core, its soul. Maybe that's the greatest strength of Kurdish culture. But it does leave you thinking, given the internal divisions that still exist, and the world's continued reluctance, really, to recognize a formal Kurdish state, How might that idea of a cyberspace state evolve? Could it become something more, a foundation for actual real-world political will, for passing identity down through generations for this huge stateless nation? What could Kurdish recognition even look like in a world shaped as much by digital networks as by physical borders? What would that demand from the rest of us?